There have been big headlines around Australia in the wake of the new federal government's first budget. Apparently, they're going to build 1 million new homes in 5 years to solve the housing shortage crisis. And there's been widespread, although not universal, applause because it looks and sounds great at first glance. And as you can imagine, the organisations that represent builders and developers are expressing considerable glee. No surprise there, because it sounds like a windfall for all of them. But that's at first glance. At second and third glance, it looks to me like a spectacular failure by the new federal government and by its Treasurer Jim Chalmers, who's Federal Labor's bright-eyed boy and no doubt their future leader. It's a spectacular failure because it shows that the government does not understand the real issues here, how the problems were created and where the genuine solutions lie. Now, this budget measure, if implemented, could potentially be great for anyone who's looking for a place to rent in 2025 or 2026. But it does nothing for all those people who need a place to rent right now, and for those who might be needing a rental home in the next 12 months. And let's be clear, there are solutions available which could be implemented today, which would increase rental supply, improve vacancy rates, and pause the cycle of escalating rents. But this federal budget hasn't made those obvious decisions. And it doesn't provide answers to key questions which will arise from the big building program that they're proposing, such as where will the bricks and the bricklayers come from? They say they'll build 1 million new homes, but it all starts in 2024, and that's too late for the people who are homeless today. What about all those extra migrants the government says they will bring in to Australia in this financial year, an extra 35,000 people? Where are they all going to live? Now, the Australian building industry is suffering from shortages of everything right now. Shortages of materials, shortages of tradespeople, shortages of service providers. The time it takes to get a home built in Australia has more than doubled in the last year or so. And because of that, the costs have escalated. So there are delays and cost increases right throughout the system, and it's not helped by the number of building companies which have gone broke this year. And there was no word from the federal Treasurer on how those issues will be resolved. And there's another problem. The federal government can facilitate the construction of 1 million new homes, maybe, over 5 years, possibly. But if property investors don't buy a big share of them, then the rental crisis will not improve. In the current climate, investors are exiting the market. Many of them are fed up, and I'll explain why in a moment. Essentially, the federal government has failed to address the core issue, the chronic shortage of rental properties that exists right now. And that's because politicians, who collectively are notorious for being out of touch with realities at street level, don't understand how we got into this mess in the first place. So here's how the rental market in Australia works. About a third of households across Australia rent their homes rather than own them. And more than 90% of the homes they rent are provided by private investors, not by government. And most of those private investors are ordinary mum and dad households on average incomes. The typical property investor in Australia owns just one property. For the past 5 years, there have been a series of decisions by state governments, by the federal government, and by regulatory authorities like APRA, which have been onerous to those mum and dad investors. Every new piece of legislation has favoured tenants to the detriment of property owners. And a recent survey conducted by Property Investment Professionals of Australia, PIPA, indicated that many people who own an investment property feel that they've lost control over their asset, and they're fed up also with being treated by government as a cash cow. So they're planning to sell. Indeed, investors have been selling for the past several years. In the recent property boom, there were more investors selling than buying. And every time an investor sells their property, the number of homes available for rent diminishes. Now, that's been happening steadily in large numbers for the past 5 years. Now, the recent housing summit organised by the Queensland State Government was guilty of the same failure as the federal budget. The organisations that represent the people who are the solution to this problem, that's private investors, they weren't even invited to the talk fest. So now we have a situation where vacancy rates are the lowest ever recorded. And as a consequence of that, rents are rising 10%, 15%, or even 20% in a single year, depending on the location around Australia. But for many people seeking a place to rent, it's not the rental level that's the biggest problem, it's that they can't find a place to rent at any price. And this federal budget does nothing to help them. Instead, it's provided a headline about what might happen in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time. So my reaction to the federal government's headline policy announcement, in a word, is hopeless.